They laughed when they saw her walk onto the shooting range with dirt-stained shoes, an old wool sweater, and a worn-out Ruger in her hands. Someone scoffed, "What's she doing here? Cleaning up bullet casings." Some avoided eye contact. Others pointed and laughed out loud. And the star of the range, Travis Bennett, half joked, half sneered, "Let's hope she knows which end of the gun is which." She didn't respond, didn't fire back with words. She simply stepped into lane 6 without a word. And then, one single shot. A sharp crack sliced through the air, cutting off the laughter mid-breath. The range went dead silent, and the last person laughing was the first to lower his head. This is the story of a woman who needed no fame, no validation, and certainly no permission to make the world stop and listen. Willow Creek was the kind of place where people knew each other well enough to guess who was arriving just by the sound of their engine. But that Saturday morning, the sound was unfamiliar. A scratched-up grey sedan rolled quietly onto the gravel lot, bumping gently over potholes before stopping at the farthest corner, the spot reserved for those who already knew they weren't the center of attention. The door opened. Harper stepped out. Her dark brown hair was tucked under a faded baseball cap, her grey sweater worn thin at the elbows, her jeans faded, her old sneakers coated in red dust. All she carried was a small canvas bag, an unhurried stride, and a gaze still and calm, like windless water. She didn't glance around, searching for eye contact, didn't smile politely, like newcomers often did, to mask discomfort. Harper simply walked, as if the path from the car to the check-in desk was a trail her feet had memorized long ago. No one paid her any mind. Every eye was on Travis, the hawk Bennett, the pride of Willow Creek, the kind of man who walked into a room as if the spotlight was just waiting for him. Travis wore a polo shirt with his personal logo, reflective sunglasses, and carried a pristine Smith & Wesson that rumor claimed was a prototype sent to him directly by the manufacturer. "Hey, look at that," someone elbowed his buddy with a smirk. "She looks like she's here to apply for janitor, not to shoot." A few chuckles followed, quiet enough to deny if called out, but loud enough for Harper to hear. She didn't respond, didn't flinch. Words like that. She'd been hearing them her whole life. At the small cashier counter next to the wooden office cabins, she pulled out a brown envelope and placed it down. 1 lane, 1 hour, she said, her voice as light as breath. Frank Riley, the old manager who had seen thousands of shooters come and go, looked at her for a few silent seconds, then nodded. "Lane 6. Glasses and ear protection are on the rack. Be careful, ma'am." Harper nodded, picked up her pass, and walked away. Behind her, laughter still lingered, bullets still cracked like rain on a tin roof. But in the breeze that passed quietly through the range, something had just shifted. They didn't know it yet. That woman hadn't come to make noise. She came to remind this place of something it had long forgotten. Some people learn to shoot to win. Harper didn't. She learned to shoot so she wouldn't lose her father. Her first memory of a gun wasn't the sharp crack of a bullet, it was the smell of old wood gun oil and dry hay. That winter had been unusually cold. The wind howled across the fields, but Harper's father patiently loaded each lead bullet into the tiny revolver. She stood behind him, hands stuffed into the oversized pockets of her coat, wide-eyed with anticipation. "You don't need to beat anyone," he said, as he placed the tiny, paint-chipped .22 in her hands. "You just need to beat the fear." He taught her everything, not by commanding it, but by embodying it. The way he lifted the gun, like it was something sacred. The way he aimed, breathed, and squeezed the trigger, as if each shot were a whispered prayer. "Don't force the trigger, Harper. Let the bullet be surprised it was even fired." She giggled then, not fully understanding, But later, every time she faced something frightening, a test, a new job, or a contemptuous glance, that sentence returned like a single note ringing out in stillness. They weren't wealthy. Their farm was just enough to keep hunger at bay. Her mother worked part-time as a teacher. Her father did everything: tractor repairs, corn planting, and sometimes hunting for hire. Everything he taught Harper was quiet, seasonal, like sowing seeds, waiting, harvesting, and learning to accept when the season gave nothing back. In the late afternoons, after the chores were done, father and daughter would head out behind the shed. Tin cans, soda bottles, and old bricks became their targets. Harper soon shot more accurately than her father, but he never said it aloud. Instead, he'd pat her shoulder every time she hit the mark. That one landed because you remembered to breathe. There were no medals, no applause, just silence, red dirt, and a father who knew that one day his daughter would need a skill that seemed useless, not to become famous, but to stay whole in a world that demanded too much too fast. Harper never thought she'd bring a gun to a competition, but the bullets her father once taught her to fire were still in her hands, in her stance, in her breath, to this very day. Lane 6 was near the far end of the row, a modest position far from the heart of the shooting range where the crowd had gathered to hear Travis talk about his new tactical technique. Harper didn't glance in that direction. She simply placed her bag on the old wooden table, brushed off the thin layer of dust with her hand, and unzipped it. Not a single clink. Everything in her bag was arranged with ritualistic care: a cleaning cloth, noise cancelling headphones, safety glasses, and her old Ruger 22, not flashy, not fitted with any laser sights, but clean enough to catch the faint sunlight filtering through the tin roof. She released the safety, loaded the bullets with a focus that felt almost meditative, not a single wasted motion. Her fingers moved like they'd done this 1,000 times because they had. But no one was watching. All eyes were still on Travis, who was demonstrating how to neutralize 5 targets in 3 seconds with grand gestures and a voice that was half lecture, half showman's flair. The crowd circled around him like they were watching a magic trick. Meanwhile, Harper pulled her glasses down, slid her headphones on, and stood up straight. That moment looked like a frozen frame from a forgotten day. A plain woman in a plain setting. No one expected to remember her after today. Then she pulled the trigger. The first shot rang out, not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to make a few heads turn. The bullet tore through the air and struck the center of the paper target with chilling precision. A perfect circle, dead center. In the red zone, not even a millimeter off. Harper didn't stop. She fired a second shot, another bullseye, then a third, a fourth. Each round stacked over the last, creating a tight cluster so precise it could have been fired by a machine. Frank Riley, walking the line behind the shooting stalls, slowed his steps when he saw that grouping. He frowned. A man like him had seen enough to know the difference between luck and skill. And what he was seeing wasn't luck. "Who's that lady on lane 6? A teenage boy whispered to his friend. "No idea. Probably someone testing out a rental," the friend replied, but his eyes didn't leave Harper anymore. In a world that favors loud voices, sometimes it's silence that echoes the farthest. And in that very moment, no one said it aloud, but the entire range had started to look at her differently. The tight cluster of shots on lane 6 was no longer just a technical detail, it had become a silence within the noise of Travis's performance. A few people turned their heads to look, then a few more. Attention began to shift, peeling away from the spotlight-drenched corner where Travis was putting on his show and drifting toward the solitary figure, standing motionless at the edge of the range. Harper kept shooting, as if no one were watching. Her grip was steady, her rhythm as measured as breathwork. Each trigger pull was a quiet interval, not for show, not to prove anything. Just her and the target, like when she was 10 years old in the backyard of her parents' farm. But that very lack of performance was what impressed people most. Frank Riley leaned against the wooden door frame, arms crossed. He knew the difference between random luck and discipline, so ingrained it lived in your muscle fibers. Harper belonged to the latter. She didn't need a spotlight. Her presence alone made a quiet declaration, "I'm here, and I know exactly what I'm doing." Across the range, Travis Bennett had just finished a rapid-fire demo. The crowd applauded. He removed his safety glasses, wiped his brow, and gave the same smile he used whether he'd just won or needed to hide something. A staff member leaned in to whisper in his ear. Travis frowned, then lifted his gaze toward lane 6. His eyes narrowed. There, in the diagonal slash of sunlight and shade, Harper was calmly reloading. She seemed unaware, or perhaps deliberately indifferent to the fact that she was now the subject of whispered conversations. Travis took a few steps in her direction, not quite approaching, but close enough to mark his territory. He wasn't used to being distracted, especially not by someone no one could name. "Who is that girl?" Travis asked a nearby technician quietly. "No idea. She signed up for lane 6 this morning. No one from the team invited her." Travis smirked. "I don't buy that." His eyes flicked to the empty magazine on Harper's table, then to the distant target. A single, perfectly centered hole, tight, clean, symmetrical, felt like a slap in the face to every lecture he'd just given. Still, he straightened his back, adjusted his collar, and turned back to the crowd. "For our next demo, we'll be working on the double tap, a close-range control technique. But if anyone feels confident, I always welcome a newcomer to give it a try." His words floated like a baited hook in the breeze. Not only did the audience know exactly who he was referring to, Harper did too, but she didn't react. She simply loaded the next round as gently as if she were placing a memory in her own hand. The confrontation hadn't started yet, but both of them could already feel the other's breath. Before that day at Willow Creek, Harper hadn't stepped onto a shooting range in nearly 10 years. She didn't quit shooting out of disinterest. Quite the opposite, shooting had once been part of her, inseparable from the memories of a father who taught her how to breathe deeply while waiting for a squirrel to poke its head out from behind a log, how to keep her hands soft on the trigger, and how to accept that some shots, no matter how well prepared, would still miss. She gave it up because of life. As simple as that. Because her father died too soon from a stroke during the coldest winter in Wisconsin. Because of the modest funeral, the pine wood casket, and the hymn that echoed through fingers too numb to hold a gun. And because, after that, everything had to fit into 2 words: responsibility. Harper had once dreamed of going to college to study interior design, but after her father passed, she set aside her application and took 2 jobs at once, making coffee by day, waiting tables by night, saving every penny to keep the small house for her mother and younger brother still in school. Shooting. It had no place in a schedule crammed with bills and sleepless shifts. Every now and then, when she was too exhausted to think, she'd dream of tin cans lined up behind the chicken coop, of her father's laughter the first time she knocked a cap off a soda can. But then the alarm would blare at 5 a.m., snapping her back to a reality filled with ledgers, electric bills, and customers fuming over a wrongly sweetened latte. For 10 years, the Ruger 22 lay untouched in a cloth-wrapped bundle, nestled in one of her mother's old handkerchiefs, buried deep in a dresser drawer. She didn't avoid it because she feared guns, but because she feared the memories waiting to rush back like a trigger she could no longer control. It wasn't until one slow Friday afternoon at work that something shifted. A new co-worker named Nancy Whitmore started talking about how she went to the range every weekend to unwind. Harper just smiled politely at first. But then, Nancy invited her along, mentioned a place called Willow Creek, quiet, friendly, not too far away. Harper didn't know why. She said yes. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was some dusty part of herself waking up without warning. That first visit back, Harper's hands trembled, not from fear of the gun, but from the fear that she'd lost it, that silence, that balance. But with just one shot, everything came back like it had never left. Because memories, if they truly belong to us, don't rust. No one was chatting like before. The earlier jokes had vanished, dispersed like cigarette smoke in the wind. The woman on lane 6, the one people hadn't even bothered to glance at, was now the center of every gaze. Not because she was loud, not because she put on a show, but because her bullets were saying things words never could. Harper stood still, her left hand resting gently on the barrel, her right hand loading the next round. She didn't look to either side, yet she could feel 3 distinct gazes on her, each from a different place, each for a different reason. Frank Riley leaned against the wooden door frame, arms folded, eyes narrowed, somewhere between doubt and admiration. He'd seen good shooters before, some trained in the military. But there was something different about Harper. It wasn't her speed or precision. It was the ruthless calm. She let no emotion interfere. She shot like she breathed. Nancy Whitmore, the co-worker who had invited her weeks ago, had just arrived, still holding a coffee from the corner store. She froze when she saw Harper on the line gun raised target, riddled with tight clusters of perfect holes. Nancy had never seen Harper like this. She'd always assumed Harper was quiet, someone who followed others' lead. But now the woman standing there felt like a completely different being, composed, commanding, and almost untouchable. And then there was Travis Bennett. Travis didn't look at Harper directly, just a sideways glance, but one sharp enough to cut. He was measuring her, assessing the threat. "She's good," he admitted silently. There was something about how she held the gun. Not amateur, but at the same time, his ego so accustomed to applause and deference started to itch. This was his range, his exhibition, and now the entire atmosphere was tilting toward a stranger, unacceptable. "Probably just a lucky streak," he muttered to the man beside him, though he didn't quite believe it himself. Harper fired the next shot. The bullet tore through space, hitting the target like a note perfectly in tune. The new hole nestled beside the others, forming a clean triangle, something even trained professionals struggled to do in imperfect conditions. Now the murmurs began. "Who is she? Never seen her before. I thought she was just setting up targets." Harper didn't hear them. She didn't need to. The silence between bullets was where she returned to herself, to late afternoons behind the chicken coop, to her father's voice echoing gently in her memory. "If your hands don't tremble, the world will." "The lady on lane 6. The words dropped like a pebble into a still lake. Movement ceased. Heads turned. Eyes shifted away, hoping not to be the next one called. Only one person didn't turn. Harper remained still, checking her gun, changing her magazine, as if she hadn't heard a thing. But inside, she heard every word. Clear, sharp, deliberate. Travis Bennett stepped out from the crowd like a man descending from a pedestal to grant someone a favor. His hand still held his gleaming Smith & Wesson. His collar was neatly pressed. His smile was half cordial, half challenging. "Not everyone has the guts to test themselves in front of an audience," he said loudly, his voice laced with a sugary hint of mockery. But if someone is having a good streak and wants to show off, this range is always open. I'm happy to step aside. His eyes landed squarely on Harper. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who someone meant. Frank Riley furrowed his brow. Nancy gripped her coffee cup tightly. A teenage boy muttered under his breath, "He's not going to let this go." Harper calmly placed her gun on the table. She removed her safety glasses, took off her ear protection, each movement as slow and deliberate as someone finishing a song they didn't particularly like. No visible emotion, no irritation, just eyes, still as a lake before a storm. "Thank you, but I'm practicing," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, calm enough that it forced everyone listening to reflect on their own tone. Travis laughed. A laugh with no real humor in it. "Practice is great," he replied, "but sometimes what separates the good from the great is the willingness to step out of your comfort zone." A few in the crowd nodded, half convinced, half swept up by the theater of it. But others began to squirm. Deep down, they felt it. This wasn't an even challenge. This was a sugar-coated ambush. Harper gave a small nod, as if acknowledging his words. Then she turned back and continued loading her bullets. She didn't need to argue. She chose to let the guns speak for her. Travis hesitated. No retort, no anger, just a brief stutter in his rhythm, the kind of stumble only powerful people make when faced with someone who refuses to play their game. Frank smirked subtly. He'd seen a lot of standoffs on the range, but one fought with no reaction at all. That was new. The silence Travis left behind after his taunting invitation didn't last long. Harper didn't fire back with a challenge, didn't step onto any pedestal of glory. She simply lowered her head, reloaded, and returned to her target. But in that moment, something shifted. Because when a woman is pushed into the spotlight, and she still keeps her breath steady, the audience starts to lean in. Harper stepped into position. The paper target in front of her was a standard one, concentric rings, printed on a white board, clipped tightly into a wooden frame. But what made it special wasn't the target itself. It was the distance. She had quietly taken several steps back, placing herself far beyond the standard range for short-distance drills. Frank Riley squinted. He realized she was standing over 25 meters away, a range even semi-professionals approached with caution. "What's she doing?" someone whispered. "She's testing herself." Another replied, voice edged with unexpected reverence. Harper raised her gun. Her breathing was steady, though her chest trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something stirring deep within memory. She saw her father's face again, saw the patch of earth behind the old barn where he lined up soda cans in a row. "You don't have to beat anyone, Harper," his voice echoed in her mind. "Just beat yourself." She held her breath. Her finger tightened. The first shot left the barrel. Crack. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the skeptical crowd straighten in their seats. A single clean hole appeared dead center in the red zone. Neat, unshaken, undeniable. Frank inhaled sharply through his teeth. He'd seen many bullseyes, but from that distance, with a stock .22 and no modifications. That was a declaration beyond words. Harper didn't stop. Second shot nearly kissed the first. Third almost stacked right on top. The cluster wasn't about speed. It was about deliberate precision. Each bullet was like a stroke in a minimalist painting. The fewer the marks, the less margin for error. Nancy stood nearby, still holding the now cold coffee. She said nothing, but deep in her eyes, what she saw was no longer the quiet co-worker she thought she knew. It was a version of Harper no one had ever truly seen. Travis, watching from across the range, wasn't smiling anymore. He leaned in to whisper something to his assistant, but his voice had dropped, and his hand almost involuntarily tightened around the grip of his pistol. But Harper remained where she was, shoulders straight, wrists steady, eyes unshaken. Not a single word, and yet she had just taught the entire range a lesson. Not about marksmanship, but about this: there are people who don't need to be chosen to deserve every eye in the room. Travis wasn't used to being looked at. Second, he had always been the center, the one eyes found. First, the one whose words ended every conversation. Ever since he stepped onto the local shooting scene, he had been hailed as a phenomenon: flawless technique, impressive speed, and above all, performance charisma. But that morning, he wasn't the one being watched. He was the one doing the watching. And it stirred within him a feeling both familiar and dangerous insecurity wrapped in wounded pride. Travis walked to the center of the range, where the crowd had gathered. He didn't look at Harper, but his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's good. I'll give her that," he said, the smile on his lips curving just slightly off balance. "But hey, everyone has a good day now." And then right, a couple of bullseyes don't make a marksman. What we need is a real challenge. A murmur spread. Some nodded, others stayed quiet. But everyone could tell Travis wasn't speaking to the audience. He was speaking to himself. Frank Riley frowned. He hated that kind of compliment, praise, used as padding for a subtle dig. But he said nothing, because he knew when the ego of someone used to being the best begins to shake, only the truth can save him, or break him. Harper didn't respond. She didn't need to. She understood the oldest rule on every range: those who talk the most usually shoot the least. Nearby, Nancy still stood beside Lane 6 when she heard a small group of young men behind her laughing. Her gun's probably been modified, or maybe the targets were rigged. If she entered a real match, she'd fold fast. No one said it outright, but they didn't have to. Their tone was enough cut, with just enough venom to infect. Harper heard every word. Her ears were well trained for this schoolwork, and now, the shooting range. There was a silent prejudice that every woman carried into male-dominated arenas. If you're good, it must be a trick. But Harper didn't turn around. She didn't rebut. She simply smiled. Not a smirk, not defiance. Just the weary smile of someone who's seen this far too many times to feel anything but calm. Travis approached Frank. "Set up the spinner drill," he said curtly. Frank nodded, pointing toward the rotating target rig used only in professional-level tournaments. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Time to show them what real skill looks like." And just like that, the game began to sour. It was no longer a performance, no longer a gathering. Now it had become a battlefield where fear wore the mask of pride. Everything was cleared swiftly. A special area was set up in the center of the range in full view of the audience. Wooden benches were pushed aside. A heavy iron frame was wheeled out. On it hung the spinner, 6 round steel plates mounted on freely rotating arms. This was a drill rarely used outside of official tournaments. The moment a plate is hit, the whole mechanism spins unpredictably. It demands speed control and near-perfect reflexes. Travis stood before it, rolling his shoulders. Shooting gloves on electronic earmuffs, snug, mirrored glasses, perfectly positioned, every detail meticulously staged for a performance. He wasn't stepping into a drill. He was stepping onto his turf. Frank stood nearby, stopwatch in hand. His eyes flicked toward Harper, still sitting at lane 6. She hadn't moved, hadn't tried to insert herself, just quietly polished her gun, as if preparing for something that had nothing to do with this. Travis raised his firearm. Beep! The timer chirped, and instantly clouds of gunpowder pulsed in rhythm. The first plate spun wildly as his bullet hit dead center. Travis pivoted, fired again. The second, third, and fourth plates followed in rapid succession. He moved like a flood, breaking through a dam, fast fluid practiced. He wasn't just shooting, he was performing. The crowd held its breath. Each clank of bullet striking steel squeezed another heartbeat, tight. Every flick of his wrist declared, "I am still the one to beat." Only when the final plate slowed its spin did anyone exhale. Frank stopped the timer. 3.02 seconds. All targets hit. No misses. The range erupted in applause. A few people even whistled. Travis turned back, arms lifted like a champion crossing the finish line. He smiled until his eyes searched for Harper. She hadn't stood up. No applause, no nod of acknowledgement. Travis walked a few steps toward her, stopping at a polite yet pointed distance. "Want to give it a shot?" he asked, voice light, though his gaze held the defensive tension of a raised shield. Harper looked up. "Not to compete with you," she replied calmly. "I just want to see if I remember what my father taught me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Travis froze. He didn't know how to respond, because for the first time he was facing an opponent who didn't want to defeat him, yet still made him feel like he'd lost. Frank watched them both, and for a brief, strange moment he realized this was no longer a spinner drill. This had become Travis's true test, whether he had the strength to stand humbled before someone who never wanted to win, but made the entire field shift just by existing. Harper stood up. No drum roll, no announcer, no cheering crowd. But the moment she rose from the wooden bench at lane 6, the entire range fell silent. She didn't hurry. She didn't look at Travis. She walked forward as if stepping into an old room in her childhood home, where the scent of pine still lingered and time had etched its marks into the walls. Sunlight slanted through the overhang, laying a pale golden hue across her shoulders like the dust of memory. Frank Riley signaled the crew to reset the spinner rig. He glanced at Harper, then asked just one quiet question. How far? Harper looked up, paused for a breath. "Farther than Travis," she said, not to provoke, but as if speaking softly to her father, who no longer stood beside her. Frank nodded. 2 more meters back. A stir passed through the crowd. But this time, there were no scoffs, just quiet anticipation. Harper stood before the target. No gloves, no tech crew. The leather on her earmuffs was worn, her safety glasses slightly scratched. The Ruger 22 in her hands didn't gleam, but it was steady, like a father's grip on his daughter's hand during her first hunt. She drew in a deep breath. Travis stood off to the side, arms crossed. He tried to seem indifferent, but his eyes never left her movements. It wasn't fear of losing, it was confusion. He couldn't grasp how she remained so calm, with every eye in the place fixed solely on her. Harper raised her gun. No one started a clock. No one counted down. No one gave the signal, because someone like her doesn't begin. She simply continues. Clank. The first plate spun hard like a windmill blade. Clank. The second followed. Clank, clank, clank. The sounds didn't come in rapid fire like Travis's. They came steady, measured like the heartbeat of someone who had known failure and kept firing anyway. One plate wobbled off center. She paused half a second, waited, then squeezed the trigger. No rush, no force, no tremble. The last plate spun in a clean, perfect arc and stopped. The entire range froze like someone had slammed the brakes on time. Frank glanced at the stopwatch, though no one had asked him to. 3.18 seconds. slower than Travis. But every plate hit, no misses, no theatrics. Harper lowered her gun. No smile, no bow. She walked back to lane 6 and sat down, like someone who had just finished weeding the garden. Not a competition, just a return to something she once loved. Nancy bit her lips silent, but her eyes were glowing with something new, the rare awe of watching a woman who didn't need to beat anyone to make an entire room go quiet. Harper didn't look at the crowd as she made her way back to the familiar wooden bench at lane 6, but she knew every eye was still following her. There was no thunderous applause, no one shouted wow, no one called her name. But that silence carried weight. It wasn't the indifferent silence from earlier. It was the stillness of a room that had just witnessed something it couldn't quite name. Nancy walked over and gently set down the now cold coffee beside Harper. "You made us all sit up," she said, with not a hint of a joke. Harper only nodded, still wiping her gun with the small cloth. That movement, to anyone watching, wasn't part of a performance. It was part of her. Across the range, Frank Riley was chatting with two coordinators when an older gentleman who hadn't said a word all day approached. "Has she ever competed?" the man asked. Frank shook his head. "Not that I know of. Not in any system I've seen." The man paused, then spoke softly, as if afraid his words might disturb something sacred. "She shoots like she's having a conversation with her father." Frank didn't reply, but a strange heat rose behind his eyes, something rare for a man who'd retired after 20 years in the Marines. Across the range, Travis Bennett was still standing. But this time, he wasn't crossing his arms. He wasn't smiling. He didn't stroll toward the crowd like usual. He was watching Harper wipe down her gun, like a ritual untheatrical. And for the first time, he saw something he had never learned: the stillness that follows victory. He had shot faster. He knew that. But for some reason, no one was talking about his time anymore. They were talking about how she waited for the final plate to realign, how she didn't waste a single bullet, how she moved with purpose, not spectacle. Travis swallowed hard. This wasn't a defeat. This was a lesson. And the cruel irony, he couldn't even ask her who she was because he had mocked her in front of everyone. The price wasn't on the scoreboard. The price was no one clapping for you anymore. A group of high school students from the neighboring town quietly approached Frank to ask for Harper's contact information. "We just wanted to know, does she teach?" Frank glanced over at lane 6, then smiled. "She doesn't teach with words. But if you're quiet enough, you might learn the whole world from her." Late afternoon. Sunlight slid off the canopy roof at Willow Creek. The breeze carried the sting of gunpowder, the scent of dry grass, and the quiet weight of a day winding down. People began packing up, collecting shell casings, stowing earmuffs, folding back the routines they knew by heart. Only one thing couldn't be packed away: what had just happened. Harper slipped her Ruger back into her bag, not looking around. She walked slowly toward the parking lot, as if it had all just been a light training session. She wasn't waiting for thanks. She didn't think anyone would remember her name tomorrow. But she was wrong. That very night, a shaky phone recording appeared on the Willow Shooters Weekly forum. Within hours, it had spread to Reddit. One user posted a headline, "Unknown woman defeats Willow Creek legend," with an unmodified 22. Every spin of the target, every movement Harper made, the look on Travis's face as she walked away, all of it was analyzed, dissected, praised, or ridiculed. The comment sections split like fault lines. "Who is she? My new hero. No way a Ruger 22 can do that. Spinner was rigged. I'll bet on it. Travis still had the faster time. You think skill is all about hitting slow and quiet, please." And then came the memes. One showed Travis staring blankly at the scoreboard with the caption, "When you get wrecked by a woman who doesn't even have Instagram." Harper didn't see any of it. She wasn't on forums, she didn't use social media, but messages began to trickle in. A sporting gear company asked if she'd like to be a brand ambassador. A local news station requested an interview. A women's shooting club from Texas emailed, asking if she'd consider being an honorary guest. She quietly declined them all. And Travis? He couldn't be quiet. His recent posts photos with rifles videos on special ops accuracy drills were flooded with laughing emojis and sarcastic comments. Sponsors began to go silent. One brand quietly removed his name from their website. A well-known shooting commentator shared the video of Harper with the caption, "This is why calm always beats flash. Simple. On target. No PR needed." Travis slammed his phone onto the table. His ego was bleeding from somewhere deep, somewhere raw. But he didn't blame Harper anymore. A part of him knew it was his arrogance that lost the match. And in that silence, an unexpected feeling began to flicker. Not jealousy, but gratitude. For the first time in his life, Travis realized there are people who don't need to beat you, to change you. A week after that quiet day at Willow Creek, Harper returned to the supply store where she worked as a warehouse manager. Nothing seemed different. Delayed orders, jammed receipt printers, a customer angry over a missing odd-size bolt. But inside her, something had shifted. It wasn't the unexpected attention. It wasn't people saying she'd defeated a local legend. It was that for the first time in 10 years, her hands didn't just feel like they were working. They felt like they were living again. That afternoon, Frank Riley called. "Harper," he said, over the phone, "I just got a call from a group running a youth firearms program in the next county. They saw the video, and they're wondering if you'd be willing to come in as an instructor." Harper let out a quiet laugh. "I'm not a coach, Frank." "I know," he said, "but you did something they haven't seen anyone else do." She said nothing. "You taught people how to stand steady, without shouting, without threats." Harper sat down beside a shelf of galvanized wire, her back resting against a supply crate. And in the stillness of the storeroom, a sound returned to her tin cans clinking in the backyard, her father's laugh, his voice saying, "Don't let calm be drowned out by noise." The session took place on a Sunday afternoon. The local range was smaller than Willow Creek, but it had the warmth of a summer farm. 13 and 14-year-old boys in baseball caps, quiet girls holding their rifles behind their backs like secrets. Harper didn't bring a spinner. She didn't bring a stopwatch. She brought a Ruger 22, a pouch of paper targets, and one question: why do you want to learn to shoot? There were shy answers: to protect myself, to be better than my brother, because it feels powerful. She nodded. She didn't correct them. Then she said, "Shooting isn't just about aiming and pulling a trigger. It's about learning how to stand still, in the noise, in the judgment, in the days you're not sure who you even are." A boy asked, "Have you ever lost?" Harper smiled. "I lost my father. I gave up shooting. I worked 2 jobs to keep our house. If that counts as losing, then yes." "But you shoot really well," a little girl whispered. "I don't shoot to be good," Harper replied. "I shoot to remember who I was when I was strong." The group fell silent. No more questions. But the way they looked at her was not like a celebrity, but like someone they could believe was real. The training session ended under the golden light of late afternoon. Harper packed up the shot-up paper targets, folding each one carefully before tucking them into her bag. Most of the kids had already gone home. Only Nancy lingered, chatting with a few parents about rifles and the upcoming hunting season. Frank Riley was rinsing his hands at the outdoor sink when he glanced over his shoulder and froze for half a second. A familiar figure had just walked through the gate, Travis Bennett. No sunglasses, no logo-branded shirt. Just a man in a plain grey button-down, hands in his pockets, walking a little slower than usual, like he wasn't sure he was welcome. Harper saw him coming from across the range. She didn't flinch. She didn't brace. She simply looked on calm, as if she'd known he would come eventually. Travis stopped a few meters away. No one spoke. The only sound was the breeze rustling through the old pine trees behind the field. Then he said, "I didn't come to ask for another chance to compete. And I didn't come to explain myself either." His voice was low, stripped of its usual swagger. Harper nodded, once saying nothing. "I came to say I was wrong," Travis continued, eyes steady. "Not because I lost to you, but because I believed someone like you couldn't beat me." Harper narrowed her eyes slowly. "Someone like me?" Travis gave a short, bitter laugh. "Quiet, not online, not a coach, not trained by someone famous, and not trying to prove anything." She nodded. "That's right, because I don't need anyone's validation to know who I am." He looked down. "It took me days to understand that. People online called me a loser, but it was your silence that kept me up at night." Harper looked at him. In that moment, she didn't see a rival, just a man trying to stitch something back together within himself. "You taught me a lesson without saying a word," he said. "By not stepping forward, you stood taller than all of us." Harper replied softly, "I never wanted to stand taller than anyone. I just didn't want to bow to arrogance." A long silence. Then Travis reached out his hand. "Maybe we won't be friends, but I hope I can still be a student who wasn't too late." Harper looked at his hand, hesitated half a second, then stepped forward and shook it. No applause, no cameras, but in Frank's eyes, from where he watched at a distance, that was the most meaningful moment he'd ever witnessed at Willow Creek. Not because someone won, but because both had learned how to grow without needing to win. A month after that final training session, Harper no longer came to Willow Creek. There was no announcement, no goodbye. She just stopped showing up. The same way she had arrived, without an audience, without introduction, without needing anyone to know her name. Frank Riley understood. He didn't call. He didn't text. But every Saturday morning, he still kept Lane 6 open until noon, like a habit too quiet to quit. Nancy still spoke of Harper when someone asked. "She's like a song that doesn't need a chorus," she'd say. "You only have to hear it once, and you'll remember it forever." And Harper. She returned to the small things. Warehouse shifts, quiet evenings, reading by the window, morning coffees made for her mother, and the surprise calls from her little brother off at college. The Ruger 22 was cleaned, wrapped once more in her mother's old handkerchief, and placed in the wooden drawer by her bed. Not locked away, not hidden, but no longer the centerpiece. She didn't need to pull a trigger every week to remember who she had been. She just needed to breathe and be grateful she hadn't faded quietly before showing the world something they should have seen long ago. One autumn afternoon, she returned to the patch of land behind the old chicken coop, the place where tin cans were first lined up, where her father had once stood behind her, adjusting every finger, every breath. The grass had grown tall. The boards had begun to rot. But standing there, Harper didn't feel lost. She felt whole. No longer the mysterious woman who shattered the spinner record. Not the one who made Travis bow his head. Just a girl who had been taught how to face a target with eyes wide open and a heart at ease. She raised her hand, tracing the shape of a shot in her mind. No gun, no bullets, just a gesture, as old as memory. The wind moved gently across her shoulders, and for a fleeting second, she felt it her father standing behind her again, saying nothing, just placing a hand on her shoulder like he used to. No need to say, "Well done." No need to say, "You won." Just the quiet presence of what was right. People would forget Harper's name. The videos would be buried beneath new trends. The shooting ranges would buzz again, with new technicians, new talent, new egos. But one thing would remain. The moment a woman stepped forward, not to compete, but to remind everyone that silence itself can be a form of power. And sometimes, the truest shot is the one no one needs to witness. The lesson here, that in a world where the loudest voices often drown out the truth, there are still those who choose silence, not because they are weak, but because they understand when the moment is right, silence can echo louder than any sound. Harper didn't come to win. She didn't issue a challenge, didn't make a statement, didn't try to prove anything. But it was precisely that quiet resolve, that unwavering gaze while standing alone among doubters, that forced an entire system to re-evaluate itself. The message of this story isn't in the bullseye. It's in how a woman walked through ridicule without ever losing her kindness, her dignity, or her belief in what's right. She didn't retaliate against Travis. She didn't try to defeat anyone. She simply stepped forward, fired one shot, and returned to her place. And that moment changed everything. I believe every one of us, no matter who we are or where we come from, has had a moment like Harper's, being judged by appearance, by silence, by the timing of our voice. But maybe, just maybe, not reacting is also a form of strength. Not everyone needs to shout to be heard. Not everyone needs to win to earn respect. So if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or told you weren't enough, remember this: steadfastness, when rooted in quiet and kindness, will always have its day. A day when the world will finally stop and listen. If this story resonated with you, leave us a message. Maybe you were once Harper, or maybe you met someone like her, unassuming, uncelebrated, but unforgettable. Share this video with someone who might need that reminder of quiet strength. And if you'd like to hear more stories that seem small on the surface, but leave an echo long after, subscribe to Toch Story, where we tell the tales that don't shout, but stay with you.